did a video recently talking about the Philosopher King, which is a concept from Plato about what he believes is the best type of ruler or government, at least based on the book The Republic, where philosophers and the most skilled, or I guess qualified of those, would become rulers, and they would become kings who had, in effect, absolute power, with the belief being that because they were philosophers, they were seekers of wisdom and knowledge and truth, you can trust them to act in good faith and to do the right thing. And that's the best you can hope for in terms of a government or a leader. Now, I talked about how I don't necessarily see eye to eye with that, potentially, because I don't think any true philosopher king who truly understood, objective truth and seeked wisdom and knowledge would ever want absolute power. They would openly ensure that there's a process to question them and to keep them in check, because they would acknowledge that the nature of the human mind, the nature of objective truth is ever changing, is fluid to an extent, and there's so many flaws in the human mind, and that there's just too much that could go wrong. And they would be aware of that, and they wouldn't think that they are magically above that. They might think they're best equipped to handle it, but not that they're magically above it. So they would want some of those safeguards in place. So I say all that because, naturally we spoke a lot about that in terms of politics and government and leadership. But I think there's something to be said about that concept when it comes to the media as well. The more I think about it, the more I realize that the media perhaps is the biggest, I guess I'll use the word contributor to some of the issues we have today. Now, sure, right? Somebody would jump in and say, well, what do you mean? What about politics? What about the president? What about all the partisanship and the actions by the different parties and all that stuff and their followers? And sure, right? That's a problem, without a doubt. That's apparent. But I think that becomes or is more of a symptom than it actually is the root cause. And I think when you look at the media, you see more of a root cause issue. So what do I mean by that? Well, you think about social media today, and that a lot of people get information from there, even the media themselves. They pull a lot of that information from social media and people tweeting, posting, sharing videos, sharing information. And the nature of how social media works is it's in effect unfiltered. Now, it's not truly unfiltered because obviously everybody that posts, they're putting it through some filter of their own, but because it's so dispersed and there's so much information, it feels unfiltered. It feels like you're getting everything. And when you start to think or believe, as I am starting to do, that there isn't one version of the objective truth, right? As I mentioned with the Philosopher Kings, they would recognize that it's fluid, it's complex. There's nuance there. There's not necessarily a right answer, right? You could pick a topic. You could pick mail-in voting, or you could pick the protests and the riots in Portland, or pick any topic, COVID. Super complex, super nuanced. The idea that there is one clear right way to view it and right perspective to have on it seems difficult to grasp. It seems easier for me to grasp the idea. It doesn't mean that's necessarily true, but it seems easier for me to grasp the idea that there's just a lot of layers to it. And you can't really just put it in a box and say, this is exactly what's happening. So when you think about information that's being shared on these types of topics on social media, you're getting the raw, just everything that's happening is being put forth, right? And it's up to the reader, the consumer of that information, to try and digest it all and try and find some version or something close to objective truth, or at the least just try and make sense of it, right? They're trying to understand, what do I do with this information? What does it mean? Is there a huge problem here? Is there not a huge problem? Do we need to fundamentally change the way we're handling the COVID situation, or do we not, right? All these things that you're trying to decipher, you're trying to do with millions of bits of information coming at you. And it feels like, at best, that's a Herculean task. At worst, it's an impossible task. It's not something an individual can really do. So why did I mention the media as kind of a key piece of this? Well, if you look historically, I think the media, for better or for worse, whether intentional or not, has played somewhat of a philosopher king role when it comes to information. you look back over the last 100 years, even in just America, prior to social media, if you go back far enough, even prior than like cable news, 24-hour news cycles, there was limited ways in which people got their information. There were newspapers. Once TV came about, there were newscasts, journalists, reporters, etc. And again, for better or for worse, those people had the power to an extent. They had the power of information and knowledge, and they shared it. And in theory, if they acted in the spirit of the Philosopher King, they tried to do it in a way in which they were trying to present what they believed was objective truth or close to it, what they believed was the right information on this topic, which was most relevant. Now, it didn't always work, obviously. Lots of things have been hidden by the media, and it's allowed for issues with poverty and racism and corporate corruption and political corruption and all sorts of atrocities, right? The media didn't get it perfect, but in theory, that was their function. And for better or for worse, that phenomenon we talk about today with social media, where there's just millions of bits of information flying at you, that didn't happen. Maybe the story you were getting or the version wasn't necessarily the best one, but you were getting a simplified version of it in which people could digest, and they knew how to respond. In some ways, they might have been told how to respond, but they could work with that. It doesn't exist as much in today's world, right? Social media feeds so much of the information. Even media, again, gets a lot of their information from social media. And media itself has become, possibly out of necessity, right, adapt or die, they've adjusted their approach. It seems as if the goal isn't as much objective truth anymore. It's more about trying to maintain a base of followers and readers and playing more to that base, right? That becomes the objective. So you get, what you get. Even, obviously there's the Fox Newses of the world or the MSNBCs that are obviously, seem to have some bias and slant to it. But even when you start to look at some of the more reputable, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, all these things, it's very difficult to trust anymore, right? The belief isn't there. And again, perhaps part of that's because of social media, because you're seeing so much of the truth, and then you're just seeing one sliver of it from media. You say, well, it's more complex than that, than what you're telling me. There used to not be a reference point. So whatever they told you, you had no reason to believe it was more complex than that. So, we could spend, and maybe we will, another video on dissecting that aspect of it, but it seems like the result is the result. You have people trying to make sense of an unimaginable amount of information on different topics that are unbelievably complex and likely don't have a single objective truth to it, but they're trying to make sense of it. And what you end up with is what we have. You have somewhat of chaos. You have some people that cling to the extremes, right? And some of those media outlets that are pushing certain agendas that are simpler and they can digest it, but it's messy and it's an extreme, almost, exaggerated version of what's actually happening. And that's not great. Then you have other people that say, hey, I want to get to the objective truth. So they'll go more to the source, they'll go on social media, but our minds can't process that much. Again, so you just do the best you can. And it leaves you again in the situation I think we have today with just factions and divisiveness and chaos to an extent, and nobody really knowing what's happening on any of these issues. They're just taking their best guess, and they see something bad happen in Portland. Well, it must have been Antifa, and it must have been Black Lives Matter because I see them destroying things. Oh, but wait, there was something right before that where somebody provoked it. But wait, they provoked it because something before that felt, and it's just, and at best you're getting bits and pieces of that and trying to piece together and make sense of it. And again, it's almost an impossible task. So I'll end with this point. I come back to the Philosopher King. That seems to be, that concept seems to be something we need today in the media. We need somebody that can be trusted. We need somebody that can provide as close to objective truth as they can, acknowledging the downfalls, acknowledging the complexity of it, and that they can't have the full picture. Not trying to spin certainty and simplicity, but trying to give it for what it is, right? There has to be a degree of it, which is counter to what I believe in my heart. So this is difficult for me to say, and I think I need to work through it a little bit more, but it almost seems like the function of media. If in the spirit of that Philosopher King, and I think this was Plato's point, you sacrifice a bit of truth for simplicity. You sacrifice that to get it done, to get to a place that's better, safer. And there's all sorts of flaws in that, as we talked about, but it seems like to keep the lid on things, to keep things in check, perhaps that's what you need. And the best you can hope for is that media agency or whoever it does that's doing it, they act in the spirit of the Philosopher King, and they try their best to work towards, truth and questioning and checking their biases, etc.